Thank you to the delegates joining us online. A reminder to you and those in the room that you can submit your burning questions via the app, though I would like to throw to the floor for some questions for this session as well. A reminder also that if you are continuing the conversation online, please use the hashtag #OutlookCorrection, that is ABARES Outlook. Now, we've heard a lot about the cost and the burdens of production. Today, we're going to take a slight shift and we're going to talk about securing production and securing the future of agriculture. It's nothing groundbreaking when I say that critical inputs are fundamental to agricultural production. But ensuring that security and availability of these essential inputs is vital for the success and resilience of our farming. We're discussing this all to a backdrop of geopolitical tension. We're seeing trade routes redirected, disrupted, and that impacts more than our exports, it also impacts our imports, things which are critical to the production of farming, such as fuels, fertilisers, chemicals, and other inputs. I'd like to welcome our panel, ready to go and ready to answer these burning questions today. This will be a discussion where I ask you to join us in applying some inspirational thought, because we're taking this in a different direction. We're not going to be talking about what we know. We're going to be talking about things that are not yet realised within our regulatory system and our political system. First off, I'd like to introduce to this panel Scott Bowman. He is the president of Incitec Pivot Fertilisers. Scott was appointed president on the 1st of June 2024. During his 20-year tenure at Incitec Pivot Limited, Scott has excelled in various senior leadership positions, spanning fertiliser and chemical manufacturing and distribution, global supply chains, international commodity trading, strategy development, and customer engagement. David Jochinke, better known as DJ, and we won't attempt to spell that surname today, is a third-generation dryland mix farmer. His family property in Wimmera, Victoria, produces broadacre crops and finishing prime lambs. He's been a passionate farmer advocate since his Diploma of Applied Science at Longarong College. He was elected as president of the National Farmers Federation in October 2023 after serving as vice president and director. We'll have plenty more to hear from him with some really timely announcements that we've had in the recent days and as we gear up for an election. Our other Scott on the panel today is Scott Hansen, the CEO of Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority. Scott was appointed as CEO in July 2024 for a term of 5 years. He's an experienced executive in the primary industries sector, bringing over 30 years of leadership across various industry and government roles. He served as Director General of the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries from 2014 to 2024, and previously held positions as General Manager, Regional Manager, and Managing Director at Meat and Livestock Australia from 2004 to 2014. To set the scene for this discussion, Andrew Henderson is a leading strategic policy specialist with a passion for building the sustainability and prosperity of rural and regional Australia and enhancing the recognition of its role in the economy and its place in national security. He is an experienced independent chair and member of several national policy and implementation committees focused on traceability and biosecurity systems, research and development, service delivery, food safety and regulatory systems. It's fair to say that this is a perfectly curated panel. I've cut these bios very short, as you can probably tell from their introduction there, because I think we will see through the discussion exactly what they can bring to this discussion from their experience. So I'll hand over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Kate. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here, and g'day to the online audience. It's a real pleasure to be able to be accompanied by such an esteemed panel, but also to have the privilege of setting the scene for this discussion. It's something that various people have been talking about for a long period of time in a world that's rapidly changing around us, and we're seeing it every single day in the news. So I want to start, and I'm going to break every cardinal rule of presentations here. I've got way too many slides for the amount of time that I've got available to me, so I'll race through them. This is what it's all about. I think credit to shipmap.org.au. This image is slightly old right now, but it demonstrates visually what our connectedness to the world looks like. And that's really what this is all about. It's about Australia maintaining our connections to global trade routes, shipping where the bulk of our freight and commodities come and go on, through what is now some of the most contested maritime trade routes in the world. Everything that you have been hearing on the news, if I can just hit this, there we go, with regard to Trump, gives you the impression that it's Trump himself that's really disrupting, the global world order as we see it. But my view is that Trump's just an outworking of what this diagram demonstrates. This is from the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index, and it indicates visually what we're experiencing in reality right now and have been experiencing for some time. It's the fact that we're no longer living in what we know to be, or what we have known to be, a unipolar world order that's dominated by the United States of America. We're now living in a multipolar world where countries like China are becoming and have become great powers that are now starting to assert themselves on the international stage and have an intent to set the rules by which we trade. And that affects Australia because of that connectedness to the world and the reality that our economy, on average, is around about half of our GDP is attributable to two-way trade. So I really want to encourage you to get on the Lowy Institute website because it's fascinating to have a play with this. It tracks countries right across the Asia Pacific and allows you to make all sorts of cool comparisons. For example, if we look at their economic capability assessment, this won't be a surprise to anybody in the room that in that regard, the US and China, followed by India and Japan, are the dominant economic players across the Asia Pacific. And that's really interesting, but it's not surprising, nor is the fact that regional trade relations are largely tied to China's interrelationships across and down through the Indo-Pacific. It also reflects that we as a nation are inherently economically tied to China. America less so. But this assessment on Asian military posture, for me, I find quite profound because it demonstrates that the region is in a very fractious state. It reflects what we know to be true and hear on the news every day around the challenges associated in the Indo-Pacific, and that it's something that we really need to be cognizant of. It's a visual representation of the tension that exists in the same region that we rely on for our connectedness to the world. So from my perspective, I believe that assumptions around Australia's food security are really dangerous. We've had the benefit of what has been a relatively stable period of growth post-Second World War, but that is changing, and we've assumed that our food system will continue to be secure no matter what the circumstances. The reality is our food system has evolved off the back of globalised just-in-time supply chains. We see that any time that there is some kind of disruption for whatever reason, via supermarket shelves that quickly become empty. So think about AI, eggs. At the moment, there's empty supermarket shelves in northern New South Wales due to Cyclone Alfred. Our supply chains are tight, and they've evolved that way because that's the most efficient means of getting food onto the shelf and into consumers' hands, and also back onto ships and off for export. Now, in all of that, we really need to think about what's being done in relation to that previous slide that reflects the military posture of most nations across, particularly our region in the Indo-Pacific. And what we find is a recognition, particularly since COVID, that something's not right. We know that from the fact that the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act was implemented going all the way back to 2018. In 2020, there was a Defence Strategic Update. In 2023, we got the National Defence Strategic Review that told us that the Indo-Pacific is now the most geostrategically important region in the world, and that we must return to fundamentals to preserve Australia's national defence. That was reinforced by the National Defence Strategy that doubled down and started to talk about Australia's national power, meaning that every part of our economy needs to function and contributes to our capacity to be able to defend ourselves from anything from economic coercion, grey zone conflict, to actual armed conflict within our region. Neither of those two documents touch on food at all, and that reflects the inherent assumption in our defence organisation that we will be food secure because we're a net exporter of food. Now, on the other side of the equation, in 2023, things like supply chain disruptions owing to COVID, all sorts of other economic issues, productivity challenges, migration challenges really brought on the instigator of the Australian food story, Feeding the Nation and Beyond report, and the committee inquiry that sat behind that. For me personally, I found that really useful because it collated 188 submissions from stakeholders right across the food system. That was a simple one-stop shop for me to go and find a whole bunch of new friends that were also advocating for a national food plan or a national food security policy or something of that nature. Now, what that inquiry's report did is it galvanised the food system support around the fact that we have to accept that we are more vulnerable than we would like to think we are. A clear demonstration of the dischunk nature and the challenge associated with achieving reform when it comes to this type of stuff is the fact that a separate committee released another report as recently as last month, also with the same primary recommendation around the creation of a national food plan. Now, encouragingly, we've seen that there's been an announcement yesterday, as you would all have known, from Minister Collins to create a national food security strategy. And that's been critical to the work that we've been trying to do through the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in looking at how preparedness can form the basis of any national food security strategy. And that's been backed by a lot of different stakeholders. Many different stakeholders have called for that. And interestingly, you'll see there in the middle, I just dug that up last week, The Guardian, a story from a UK mob that have also come to nearly the same exact conclusions that we've been coming to about the critical vulnerabilities that we face with regard to maintaining food supply in a disrupted environment. So the creation of a national food security strategy has been something that food system stakeholders right across the board have wanted for a long period of time. ASPI's involvement in this and my involvement through ASPI has really to make sure that we can bridge the gap to go back between what our defence forces and the defence organisation and national security agencies in this country are preparing for and what we in the food system are preparing for. Because the reality is they've been two different disparate futures and we need to bring them together. So through the work of developing this National Food Security Preparedness Green Paper, we've been engaging with a range of different food industry stakeholders, and some of you are in the room, and I will extend my deep appreciation to you all for having backed this process in and been involved in it, because it is a different approach. We're operating on the basis that we can no longer view Australia's agriculture sector and food system as different things. We must start to see our food system as a food security ecosystem, something where everybody can see themselves somewhere in the ecosystem, but also identify the interconnectedness of the challenges that we're facing and understand clearly that disruptions on one side of the ecosystem can acutely and have cascading effects all the way through the other side of the ecosystem and ultimately affect people on the ground in communities, and often our most vulnerable first. Now, I'm going to end here because I guess I want to highlight the fact that this is not a new concept. The more that we've dug into this, the more that I've learned that just since 2008, there's been at least 16 different government reports, inquiries, processes, academic research conducted that's talked in some way, shape or form to the vulnerability of Australia's food security, food supply chains and what have you. As recently as I said, as last month with the Food for Thought report coming out. Now the intent of our green paper was always to bridge that gap, and that remains the case. It was always to try and be the catalyst to bring on a national food security strategy. We've been exceptionally pleased, as many other stakeholders are, that there's a commitment on the table from the current government and good signs from the opposition in that regard. But we must now turn our attention to what it is that strategy has in front of it. And so that's where we'll be aiming to lay the foundation of a national food security strategy, because the reality is, and I'll leave you with this, all of those big chunky defence documents that talk about this dangerous and chaotic future that we face say that we're out of time. We don't have the traditionally assumed 10-year warning time to prepare for armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific that would affect our connectedness to the world. So if that's the case, it means that we need to get moving. We need to get moving as quickly as we can to do whatever we can to secure the critical inputs to allow our food system to do what it needs to do, feed not only ourselves, but tens of millions of other people around the world in what could be an extremely disrupted future. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew. In preparing for this session, I looked back on some notes from previous years of ABARES conferences, and I felt that it was worth sharing this. I didn't get a chance last year in opening the conference to ask this question to the Minister of the Day. And the question was that since the pandemic, Australia has been working with the UK on a joint supply chain resilience initiative targeting, quote unquote, vulnerabilities that could impact Australia's national interest. My question to the Minister would have been, how does agriculture fit into this plan? And is it not time a dedicated plan is established within the portfolio, given what we're seeing play out in the Red Sea along with Russia's war on Ukraine? Since that 12 months, we have seen much more than just Russia's war on Ukraine impact this very base of question. And I would like to throw it to the panellists to get your thoughts on it. On my last look yesterday, there'd been no update or further interaction with the UK government on this plan, other than that it is in motion, for want of a better word. But yesterday we did have an announcement that a re-elected government would introduce a food security plan. You were part of that announcement, Andrew, so it's fitting that I throw to you first.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and look, it was a really pleasing announcement. But from my perspective, it is step one, and the job really starts now, because it has to be able to facilitate action and empower food system stakeholders, from individual businesses all the way up through to companies, to industries, to be able to begin a process of proactively assessing their own balance sheets, number one, in terms of what that looks like in a disrupted environment, as well as being able to provide them with a means of being able to understand what their vulnerabilities are, how to prioritise them, and then coordinate a process of being able to come up with mitigation measures or preparedness activities to be able to mitigate, to be able to address those vulnerabilities, to inherently embed resilience. That's like, it starts as granular as that, being able to physically equip people with a tool that they can use themselves. Some things do exist around the place, and the Office of Supply Chain Resilience does some good work in that regard, but a lot of that, my assessment, is that it's very much COVID related and very much point in time, here and now. There's a disruption. How do we do something about it? There are other bodies of work that are taking place that are more forward looking, but there's nothing that sits centrally and coordinates that process right across the food security ecosystem. And that's something that I think we desperately need, because a plan makes us feel good, but a plan without action isn't much good to us.
In your presentation there, you touched on some forecasts from defence analysts saying that we've run out of time for a military projection of force. That is not the case for agriculture, which sits in a very different space, unarmed, with different markets and weapons at its disposal. One of those is soft diplomacy in the way of interacting with our markets and export nations. I'd like to throw to you on that, DJ, the role that often gets overlooked in soft diplomacy of the agricultural industry.
Well, afternoon, everybody. It would be very rare that if you're wanting to do a deal with another person or another nation that you didn't personally know the agency or the key players before you go to the deal itself. And what we're seeing at the moment is a couple of our traditional relationships being challenged by essentially somebody using the X platform. And that is a very concerning way that could play out in both what is real and what is not. What is the actual fact of the matter? And in agriculture, we're always wanting to make sure that we are talking with all the evidence and facts on the table, because our principle is we want to abide by trading rules. We believe in the free market. We believe in trade agreements that have rules, and we have a WTO that will enforce those rules if players don't adhere to it. And we saw that with our relationship with China when that broke down, and how much impact that can have on all sectors. And as a farmer myself, it only takes one, if not two, things that can really make it challenging for production. But then when you lose some of those key partners in that production system, so that's either in the supply chain or customers themselves, we're quite vulnerable in how we move things, for starters, because we are, to lift and shift things in Australia, it is relatively expensive compared to other nations, and also tyranny of distance. But also multiply that by the fact of we generally, as once again a farmer, we've got to get the stuff in to grow the crops. And Scott and I were talking about energy and the need for energy, and how that's a real cornerstone of all of our systems. But then secondly, what does that mean for the consumer? How do we ensure that we're getting the starch and the protein that they need to the right places at the right time at the right price, and still make agriculture prosperous? So, as Andrew mentioned, with the strategy framework being announced yesterday, that gives us a lot of hope that we are going to start addressing some of those key issues that it's the unknown knowns. I won't quite quote Donald correctly in this one, but we do know some of our weaknesses, but we don't know what that looks like when there's stress test. And who would have thought that we'd ever run out of toilet paper in the nation? Who would have thought we'd run out of eggs? Both have happened, ladies and gentlemen. So that's the gravity of the situation we find ourselves in when we thought we're safe. We actually thought that we've got things under control, but yet that can happen.
And I guess you touched on a point there when you spoke about vulnerability. When we've heard over previous sessions throughout this conference, that word has been used in the context of communication, collaboration, and corroboration requiring vulnerability in discussion. What we're talking about on this panel is very much the vulnerability of systems and identifying them and pressure testing them. We've got two Scotts on the panel. I'm going to refer to them as Fertiliser Scott and Chemical Scott. There's a little bit of synergy there, but some differences too. On the point of vulnerability, I'd like to throw to Fertiliser Scott first, please. What did we see in the immediate after effect of the war in Ukraine in terms of exports and imports of fertilisers into nations globally that relied on those two countries?
Yeah, you saw a shift in supply chains, in global supply chains. So there was a move to different supply nations supplying different demand points. Although I would say that what we did see was that the majority of fertiliser demand was met at that time. You know, you still got Russian ammonium phosphates and Russian urea finding their way to the US, for instance, under the USDA's policy. However, it doesn't find its way into Europe. So you've seen different supply chains, and supply chains have responded to that. Andrew presented it. Fertiliser is a global business. It's a global supply chain. We bring potash out of Canada. We bring nitrogen out of the Middle East, Malaysia, Indonesia. We bring ammonium phosphates out of places like Morocco, Saudi, our own production unit here in Australia. The way we've sought to invest in that is where we've seen energy at a global cost, is to partner with Perdaman in Western Australia, where Perdaman are building a 2 million tonne urea plant right now. That will cost in the order of $6.5 billion. And we're really excited about that. We have the 20-year offtake agreement for that. When it comes online somewhere in the order of 2027. And that's being constructed right now with some global partners. And it's being constructed with global debt and global equity. So I think the other thing we need to think about here is just making sure that as Australia that we are open to and do attract global capital. Because for the industry to move forward, for it to be secure, one of the things we'll need to do is to make sure we're open to global capital.
That's quite a new concept for Australia across a lot of industries. Are you able to provide any short-term insights on how we are placing and attracting that capital to Australia?
Well, I think the Perdaman arrangement is a really good example of that, where you get the right level of innovation and the right level of productivity. The productivity of that plant, it's at the right policy settings for energy in Western Australia, so it's globally competitive. It's scale, and the proponent of that plant, Mr. Vikas Rambal, has been really innovative in the way he's thought about constructing that plant and making it globally competitive. It'll be one of the lowest CO2 production of urea plants in the world, and from a proximity perspective to Australian agriculture. When David and I were talking about this before, we're talking 8 to 10 days sailing away from Geelong or Brisbane, as compared to bringing product out of the Middle East, which is some 35 to 40 days. So there's a real benefit in terms of making sure that we can deliver to people like David the right nutrients to grow the food we need.
Some of the latest fuel availability estimates would be that Australia and specifically Defence would have between 8 and 10 days of fuel supply should we enter into a conflict right now or in the immediate future. I'm very curious to hear from the panellists about how that figure sits with you in the context of agriculture, given the reliability on fuel, and also some of the options that might be available. We hear a lot about the opportunity for biofuel, yet you spoke about being globally competitive. And we know that when we look at sugar and cane, they are influenced by global markets and global companies where it's not necessarily globally competitive for them right now to start that industry in Australia when they're doing it so profitably in places like Brazil. So I would like to throw to the other Scott, and what is the role of government when it comes to attracting and incentivising some of these opportunities to be done here domestically?
Great question. Not get in the way, make things simpler. I mean, government basically does three things. It puts money into the economy, takes money out of the economy, and regulates the economy. And so if we can do everything we can to attract money in, try to reduce the amount we take out, and work out how to make sure that the regulations are the bare necessary to meet both community and society's expectations, then I think we're getting the broad settings right. I would challenge, though, the idea that attracting foreign capital into our agricultural industry is something new. There's not too many parts of our agricultural industry in which the largest player isn't foreign owned, where even the biggest Australian players don't have significant foreign investment.
I should point out, when I made that remark, I was more referring to energy and security and these other parts of the system and chain supply which secure the production as opposed to the agricultural food production itself.
I just know how much people like disagreement between panellists. So
It's great. Keep it coming.
Sort of jump at every chance I can. No, but I do think it's a missing part of the conversation so far, right? And it's going to be interesting to see, based off the work that Andrew's done, where we get to next on this, because I think the industry has taken a great degree of comfort over the years. Certainly some of the biggest trade outcomes we've been able to achieve for agriculture have been aided by multinational investments in our agricultural supply chains and industries. When you've got your own producers, processors, exporters, retailers, co-owned by customers in overseas markets as well as producers here, it makes selling the idea of a freer trading environment to overseas governments a lot easier, because that ability to sell the win-win is always on the table. And it's interesting at the moment, like in our agricultural chemical industry, there's obviously a lot of discussion happening in the big multinationals there about what do the impacts of the current environment in the US. And, the feedback we're getting from them is that because of their global footprints, they do adjust. They accommodate, they find ways to adjust. And I think we've got to work out how we factor that into the food security debate and discussion, because it's not just going to be what government does, it's going to be what the big multinational supply chains choose to do with their capital and their resources that'll have a real impact.
I want to throw to Andrew on the back of that. With a little bit of a curveball, if we are able to be agile with having these global companies adjust quickly, how do we then measure that with the notion of remaining sovereign? And what does that look like in this context?
My answer to that is that I think that it's high time that we really reframe our thinking around the economic framework that guides investment, and particularly government interventions in our economy broadly, but also the agriculture sector. And to tie that back to an example of, sovereign manufacturing capability of low carbon liquid fuels and, capitalising on the evolution of biotechnology, right now it's not seen to be a viable enterprise in a business as usual market context. However, we can't assess that, and we'll argue this in the Green Paper, in isolation of the future that our defence organisation's preparing for. And we're already seeing that as recently as this morning. There's a $20 million government co-investment into an IV bag manufacturing facility in Sydney that is an American-owned corporation, I think, but it's the only facility in the country that produces IV bags. IV bags or fluid. We're seeing it with the Future Made in Australia Act. We're seeing it with interventions into Whyalla and what have you. But we'll argue that this all needs to be happening in accordance with a higher order strategic priority that identifies something like, within a reasonable framework of assessment, sovereign manufacturing capability of low carbon liquid fuels as a legitimate preparedness activity that meets the needs of many parts of the food security ecosystem. When you combine that, for example, with greater regional storage capability of liquid fuels, which we currently don't have because all of our storage exists around the coastline, you start to really you start to build genuine resilience into your sector, as well as creating other economic opportunities and development, regional communities and all of that type of stuff, and mitigating various vulnerabilities across your ecosystem. And I think that argument needs to be made. We've already got these big chunky interventions from government in the economy. Governments intervene in particularly agriculture as and when they want, when it's either politically expedient to do so or when it's absolutely necessary. So we need to hug it out with that fact, I would argue, and accept that we're living in a different world, and that if we're going to intervene in the economy, which we do in arguably a clunky and messy way anyway, let's at least do that in a way that's coordinated, and that it's in alignment with that strategic priority around making sure that we're creating greater resilience in our food system and supply chains and what have you.
And a lot of that political intervention often happens because of public sentiment, pushback, decisions on policy it's amazing how quickly they can happen when there is public outcry. So a big part of this has to be argued, how do we better communicate with the public? And I'd like to throw to you, DJ, on that, given you have such a outward-facing advocacy role.
Or just to pick up on the thread that Andrew had there, it's, has anybody heard of the town called Dimboola? Birthplace of Nick Cave? But also, in I think it was 1936. I wasn't quite there myself, but they built.
Not far off it.
They built a distillery there, and it was to process grain for ethanol. At the start of World War II, and they had a lab there and a fully functioning plant. And just before they produced their first batch of distilled grain, the war ended and it was no longer required. And it's interesting to hear the conversation around biofuels and the fact that we need to do it. We've actually been here before. We've understood that there's been an issue. We've had feedstocks, of which we're very keen to still pursue this as a national agenda as well, noting that we're looking for government to, whichever one of the day, to invest in this exact example of going, well, what are the opportunities? We know that cane has been looked at as a potential opportunity, noting that it's got processing capacities that are challenged at best due to investment or the fact that we can't make the numbers work domestically because we haven't had a company based, owned by an Australian farmer based for a very long time. But the point being, when pushed or when we have to, we can actually come up with a solution. It's how do we continue the policy to make sure that it is viable into the future? And we saw that discussion with ethanol probably 20 years ago about the E plus fuel and the opportunities we had for it. But without a mandate, it makes it really hard for the investment to stand up and then for it not to just become another Warwick and Bill story. So as agriculture goes, obviously our primary purpose is to get that protein and starch where it needs to go, transforming that energy into food through the best research and technology. And hopefully everybody in the room's heard of the $100 billion ask or roadmap that the NFF's been promoting for the last 6-7 years, and it is based on 5 pillars. Now everybody looks at the 100 billion, going, "Oh, where are we? Are we up to 100 billion yet?" But the number's kind of irrelevant. It's the pillars below it that actually are the most important thing. Capital being one, people being absolutely number one, supply chains, innovation, and making sure that we are sustainable when we grow that product. But without supply chain, without those 5 things, we're really going to fall down in any of those aspirations to increase the value. But the main thing is, to attract investment, we need either strong policy that encourages or gives.
And that's a great point to bring back to the question on how do we translate that desired policy to bring the general public along for the ride to then influence our political decision makers. And I'm very conscious that the delegates with us in this room and online are a captive audience to the will and the want of the agricultural industry. So how do we translate that to people who do not have an immediate or even a distant touch point to the back end of the agricultural industry? Now, as the president for NFF, you are in a very important position to not only lobby the government of the day and future governments, but also advocate for the industry. And oftentimes, you're having to defend the industry. As a journalist, my job is really to translate to the general public often, and growing up in a farming community and then being a defence member in the Army for 7 years before coming into journalism and focusing solely on defence and agriculture, I see that as a real responsibility of mine, that translation piece, as I'm sure you do in your role. And so if the general public is to buy in to this story that we are trying to sell, and this could be a question for all the panellists, how do we have some creative thinking to bring them along for the ride?
Well, first of all, advocacy is a team sport. everybody's got a part to play in this, and our members are really crucial for that. And without those members and that support from the grassroots, I wouldn't be here today. When you talk about translating it into real-world situations, basically 30% of Australians do not have food security at the moment purely because of cost of living. 30% already. Are we feeling it in the room today? Probably not, because we're not necessarily in that socio-economic demographic. But there are people already feeling it. So when does the canary actually fall off the perch? When does that canary actually run out of puff? I think the way we're phrasing it, Andrew, is that there's a lot of things that we've seen exposed in this conversation, but it's not necessarily that the toilet's still flushing, the bread's still being able to be purchased. It's not hurting the everyday person in the supermarket per se. But we are starting to see some signs of it. But it's not necessarily it's not going to be a bow wave unless we see some critical agitation. So once again, COVID or disease in our chicken flock, or even a trade dispute that will trigger it or click it over the edge. And in agriculture too, we're quite resilient. We can handle one or two things, but it's that third thing and fourth thing that will break the system. So how do we then collectively not be alarmed, but be alert about what is the things that we have to do today, and note that those changes will take time to flow through. We can't build a fertiliser plant overnight. We can't restore a chemistry to make sure that we're be managing our soils that has a long-term effect on the next generation of farmers. These things are happening today, and we're not going to see the fruits of that decision for a while. So that's why the urgency of both the Green and the White Paper are pretty fundamental for the industry moving forward.
And urgency does not equate to alarm, which is a really important thing to point out as well. Just on the back of what DJ was saying there, Scott, who focuses on fertiliser, because I'm very aware that your given name is not Fertiliser Scott, can you add some commentary or thoughts on some of these approaches to communication and human behaviours, perhaps, on how we actually translate and engage the general public to understand or buy into some of these themes that we're discussing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Andrew put up the ecosystem before of everything and everyone that needs to access agriculture, and I'm sure that there's a lot of those things that we need to get right on that map, but I'm also sure that it's such a complex system that there may actually fundamentally be things that aren't on that. I think there's really four settings for me that are required for a functioning commercial and economic system to attract the capital we need to de-risk things. And they start with capital, and I described that before. Then you need energy, and you need the right energy policy. And you can see with a place like Perdaman, where we get the right energy policy, we've attracted $6.5 billion of that global capital. So you can see where it works. From there, you need innovation. We need people that are innovating. We need governments to allow us and help us research and develop innovation. In a fertiliser sense, that's nitrogen inhibitors. You know, these are products that we're developing alongside Melbourne University, for instance, that can improve the yield benefits, which are the principal reason that we would use them with David. But some of the work that our agronomy team have done in research and development also suggests that we can lower CO2.
So how do you sell that story to the public?
I think the way we do that is to deliver it. You know, if you get onto our social network, you know, we're trying to push that out there through a social network. We're principally trying to get the message through to people like David. We're working with those that can change and make real decisions along policy settings. So we spend a bit of time, you know, here talking to those people that are setting up those settings. But the other bit's the productivity piece, and selling productivity of Australian agriculture, and all of those individual organisations or systems that feed into ensuring that David's as productive as he needs to be, need to meet all of those things. You need energy, and you need the policy settings right there. You need the right capital and the access to global capital. Then you need innovation, and then you need productivity.
So are you telling us all that despite all of the technology that we have available to us, that human-to-human interactions are still vital?
Yes.
And those conversations need to occur to build that trust and interaction of conversation and storytelling that perhaps an AI language model or tool cannot do all the work for us as humans?
No, I think it's interactions like this. It's the opportunity for someone like myself that's making decisions about how we bring fertiliser in, where we deploy that capital, to work with people like David who are in a position of influence, and Scott and Andrew and others, the policymakers, the policy influencers across Australia, to come up with the right settings, and to endeavour to influence government to set the right settings against each of those four key inputs.
I'd like to bring in our other panellist, Scott, now. All good journos love a prop. This is from the Queensland Country Life last week. It really stood out to me because it has been some time since I've seen biosecurity dominate page 3 of a newspaper. And these reports are talking about biosecurity policy. We've also got biosecurity breaches, as well as another report talking about biosecurity officers. I'd like to bring in you, Scott, on this one. We're talking about securing the systems right now of agriculture. Then we throw in something like biosecurity and the vulnerabilities and the impact and disruptions of that. Can I throw to you on this topic, really about, again, it's translating, engaging the community, something that DJ touched on. Advocacy is a team sport, but also security.
Yeah, and you don't have policy, Scott, up here. You've got regulator, Scott. I'm very conscious that the policy team in DAF are sitting down over near table 36 and will be nervous about what I might go to.
No, you're definitely chemical, Scott,
on
right
this
now.
point.
Yeah.
So, Australia has built itself a reputation and a premier market position around the globe over the last 30 years based on our clean, green, our freedom from disease and pests, our biosecurity status. There's no doubt that we've used it to make sure that we've had preferential market access into many of the high-value markets, whether it be the American market, the European market, North Asian markets. And we've done that by continuing to promote the importance of biosecurity globally. And that's been a great tool for us. What we've seen over the years, however, has been two things happening. First thing, many of our trading partners have well and truly caught up with us on the issue of food safety, and many of them now are well and truly catching up with us on the issue of biosecurity. And at the same time, our biosecurity risks just keep growing. And they're growing because, ironically, of the increase in multinational trade and travel that's occurring, and the trade patterns and the parcels, the containers, the passengers. You know, you talked about, can't remember the last time you saw biosecurity page 3. You know, all it took was foot and mouth disease to arrive at Bali, and it was page 1. It was all over the news. Everyone remember we had incoming passengers walking through footbaths at airports. We had a quick deployment. And to be honest, the industry really stood up very quickly in terms of how it would respond and working with government.
Certainly dominated page 1, but it dominated based on one incident response.
Yeah.
Not the full spectrum of biosecurity. And that's what I really want to get to, and in this question, is the vulnerability of the entire system. We've seen many outbreaks and breaches of biosecurity since that. We've had fire ants in southeast Queensland, we've had varroa mite, and a long list nationally with many more threats. And I guess some of these reports were talking to the officers on the ground and their inability to keep up with the breaches and the risk because there is so much vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think that's like, there's numerous reports out there, whether they be SEBRA reports. I think Animal Health Australia, Plant Health Australia have all got really decent reports out there that highlight we could double the budget on biosecurity. And if we keep doing it the way we're doing it, money into current processes is never going to equal the expectations of the community or address the risks. The risks are growing at a far greater rate than what the resourcing could ever keep up with. And so that does come down to how we change our approach on biosecurity. It goes to sort of the conversation that was happening, I think, in session 7 down over there in the previous discussions around how do we take a landscape-wide approach, how do we work in partnerships, but importantly, how do we make sure people have got the right tools available to them? And having the right tool set to be able to deploy to continue to prevent biosecurity outbreaks, because it's far cheaper for this country to prevent a biosecurity outbreak than what it ever is to try to control or eradicate. That's a key component. Unfortunately, when you're preventing something from occurring, it makes it hard to continue to sell the return on investment if you're demonstrating that nothing's happening. And so that's part of the challenge that biosecurity always has, is it needs to actually make the most of those single incidents like FMD in Bali. It needs to use those opportunities to actually get focus on the whole system. And that system...
It was a really good, sorry to interrupt, it was a really good point made yesterday in one of the sessions with the Bureau of Statistics, in how we often hear, and there's a lot of ask to give all of that data to the Bureau of Statistics, but we don't often hear how that data is delivering. And so this is another good example, because prevention is an insurance policy, but how do we give back to the community to let them know that that preventative measure is working? And we're talking about biosecurity specifically here, but disease outbreak can have the same impacts. And so on that note, I'd like to ask you, what are you seeing on the ground and across different parts of Australia?
That's an interesting question, because I think the thing that really focuses, and if all you out there sort of just imagine if you're flicking through or scrolling through your feed and there's a biosecurity story, some of you might stop, but most of you will flick through, where that biosecurity story talks about a zoonotic disease that has an impact on human health, and that there's someone in hospital as a result, or there's someone ill because of a result of a disease that's jumped from a agricultural setting into a human setting. It gets a lot more attention and a lot more focus. And I think what we're seeing is some of the spread of zoonotic diseases around the globe getting closer and closer to our northern borders, which then coincided with changing weather patterns, are bringing the vectors for those down into Australia in ways in which we have never modelled or expected previously. So there's a multifaceted approach that's increasing the risks for us around biosecurity. Like the underlying challenge for all this is the fact that at the moment we know how we'd respond to it because of a rules-based trading and biosecurity agreement globally about how we deal with exotic disease outbreaks. That only stands while everyone around the globe is happy to play by global rules about how we're going to treat and deal with these things. It's the same with the preventative measures around chemical residues or food safety. We all play to a global rule around, Codex being the organisation that sets the maximum residue limits allowable for food to be sold, traded. What happens when someone decides to go off-piste with that and decide they're going to set their own rules? Now it's the regulator who has part of their core responsibility as ensuring that all chemicals used in this country are safe to people, to animals, to the environment, efficacious, but also that they are safe to trade. That throws up some really big challenges. We've got 14,000 registered chemicals in this country. There's a hard-working team back at APVMA at the moment who process about 4 new products every single day of every single week. And in all of those, they're asking the question, is this safe for trade? Now, what happens when we start getting, for example, the EU talking about retaliatory action on the US by starting to change maximum residue limits on products to say if a product is not registered for use in the EU, we're going to set its level at 0. Now, suddenly, there's a lot of work to be done to work out what industries are vulnerable at that point in time and what we need to do about that. Now, they're the kind of vulnerabilities and the risks that are sort of floating around in this current environment. It's not just the straight up and down tariffs that you're seeing, but it's how countries might respond And importantly for us, it's about how do we work in those partnerships globally to try to keep that multilateral approach that was talked about yesterday, because that's our best chance of making sure that there's global rules that we all know and can play by.
I just want to point to an announcement that was made last week by the CSIRO, which some groundbreaking research that they have traced the entire chain of chemical reactions of PFAS and found that there are ways to remove this forever chemical from the environment. That's quite significant, but also points to, I guess, the fact that while we're talking about the challenges and the impacts that are felt over here, there's also this space of research, analysis, and development happening, which is helping to bring things constantly back to the centre in some way. So, DJ, what is the role and the importance of this analysis and R&D continuing to help us in navigating, moulding and shaping some of these policies, plans and procedures that we need in place as a nation?
Well, you've got obviously the food safety.
Because it all needs to be funded, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, money's nice. There's obviously the food safety aspect, which is probably the nucleus of the conversation, but you've got to extrapolate that to, well, what is the core research that we need to do as the agriculture sector itself? And time again, we visit nations overseas, and just got to give a big shout out to Chris and Sue, who do an awesome job in actually promoting the sustainability part of what we do in ag. But the reality is, if it's a management issue, that can be replicated overseas. That's something that is an IP that we'll forever hold on to. If it's a machinery solution, a technical solution, that too can be copied. So what we have to do is continually reinvent ourselves with the innovation. Innovation for us in R&D is how we learn about things like the PFAS and whatever else that is. But who should that responsibility fall onto? And when you've got a regulator that's had a funding model, what should be some core function and public good functions that it needs to have funded on an annual basis, let alone any research or any development on top of that research? And we believe, especially when you talk about biosecurity issues, fire ants is an everybody issue. Fire ants is an everybody issue because I don't know I've never been bitten by one. I don't know if anyone in the room has. But that's a for everybody issue. So we have to be talking about this as not just what the agricultural industry can produce economically, but what does it mean on a regional, what does it mean on a nation basis? So yes, I think that the R&D levy systems that we have now is absolutely vital. We need to ensure that we don't let government or Treasury step away from their commitment on the side of production. But when it comes to core functionality, this is a responsibility that needs to be shared by everybody in the nation. And just like your toilet paper, until it's gone, you don't know how important it actually is. Don't know if that's a quote, but this is the problem. It's actually not a problem. This is how awesome agriculture is in Australia. Not only can you buy bread, you can buy 17 different types of the stuff. That's pretty awesome. That's something we should be proud of. And it's because we've got this quantity of choice that we believe that we're safe, that we believe that nothing can go wrong. So what I'm trying to say is I think we've lulled ourselves into, there's a bit of a false sense of security in what can go wrong, and I think it is a shared responsibility that everyone needs to contribute to some core functionality. Yes, agriculture needs to contribute to the keeping innovation ahead because once again that can be replicated. But as a supply chain, as a system, the benefits that we give agriculture, the knock-on effects actually benefits everyone, and that comes down to even road infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure, which anybody who lives in my neck of the woods, let alone anywhere else in Australia, it's substandard.
And you mentioned getting stung by a fire ant is pretty bad, but the damage to the land is also pretty bad. And it's a great segue to a question that's come from the floor or perhaps online. Owen Aiken has put in a question. We haven't even got to climate in this discussion, and I can see the clock rapidly moving along. But this is a question about weather. How prepared is our food system for a continent-wide extreme heat wave? We've got a cyclone about to hit in Brisbane as we speak. The question is asking extreme heat wave that wipes out primary production and affects food systems more widely. I'll throw to you on that one, Andrew.
Oh, good.
Just the easy questions for you today.
Oh no, it's a really good question, and throughout our green paper, like while my ambition has to really been to elevate food and agriculture into the inherent psyche of defence and national security. The reality is it's not just a defence and national security issue. I mean, national security is a range of different things. And in our work, we've really been focusing on any kind of disruption to our food system. And a big focus of that, of course, are extreme weather events induced by climate change and what have you. And that creates an inherent amount of volatility in production systems. And what we don't have the capacity to be able to deal with well in this country, as David touched on before, the increasingly concurrent crises that are happening at the same time in different parts of the country. So it's a legitimate question. We don't have an answer to it other than that we would absolutely have to prioritise what first in that circumstance. You know, what is your absolute critical infrastructure that you need to focus on so that you can keep the bare basics on the supermarket shelf, for example? Because what that then goes into is, and at the heart of all of this, I think, for me personally, is social cohesion. And we're living in a community right now where our social cohesion is under immense pressure for a range of different reasons. And food is absolutely critical to maintaining domestic stability, to trying to eliminate social inequality in our community. And it's our most vulnerable people that get affected first when there's disruptions to our food supply chain. So if there's ever a reason to be able to look at this in a holistic sense and start to prepare our food system for whatever the disruption might be, climate, trade-related, accident, biosecurity, or kinetic conflict, now's the time to do it.
There's a few questions coming here that talk to some of the themes that we've already discussed, but I will reframe them and put them in a way, I guess, that allows you all to answer further to some of these themes. And I'll stay with you first, Andrew. So we heard from DJ about this innovation of idea. The question here is saying, how do you effectively engage stakeholders and communities in discussions and action on food security, especially in relation to biosecurity? There's another question saying, how does the idea of security resonate with farmers and supply chain business on the ground? Could it unify government and industry? And then we've got another question that's saying the dismantling of US aid will have an impact on global ag research and good agricultural practice. Should Australia be stepping up our soft diplomacy to protect biosecurity? Tying all of those together, noting that we've already discussed some of those points, my question to you is, how do we cross-pollinate all of these bits of research, data, innovation, industries, portfolios, so that government can look at this stuff through the national security lens that your plan is proposing?
All right. I'm going to start backwards first. The dismantling of US aid is a really interesting case study that brings to light a significant opportunity that I think will present itself for Australia to increase its presence, particularly in our region, using food as a much more fundamental tool of our diplomatic statecraft. So as the US withdraws its soft diplomacy across the Pacific and the Asia Pacific and what have you, I think there is an obligation almost for Australia to step up its efforts with our other like-minded partners to increase our trade and investment capability in line with Nicholas Moore's invested 2040 strategy. I think there's some recommendations in that are really critical to this as well, with food security as a primary focus, because
and I'm sure Sue will tell you, but anyone who's been travelling around the Asia Pacific in recent years would tell you that food security is a primary priority for all of those nations on that map that I brought up who are enhancing their military posture. That's not for nothing. Hungry people are discontent. And we know that discontent breeds instability. We've been talking about this and writing about it in The Strategist for some years now. So I think the withdrawal of US aid presents that opportunity. We're going to talk about that in the Green Paper because another critical reality is that half the world's undernourished population lives in the Asia Pacific. And there's one in two people in the Western Pacific, I think, are undernourished. That's our region. So when 30% of our own population are experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity every year, and half the world's undernourished population lives more or less in our region, then it's imperative for us to use our productive capacity not only to secure our own social foundations using food as a primary mechanism to do that, but then also to assist other nations through genuine mutual benefit to assist with their food security imperatives. I think being able to view our food system and the agriculture sector as an ecosystem captures every part of it. Going back to those real back-of-house regulatory systems and policy-making processes that if they fail, for example, like the NLIS or our traceability systems or the export certification systems that the department uses to facilitate over $200 million worth of trade every single day, then we're going to experience some significant impacts associated with that. We can't do everything at once, I don't think, but we need to begin the process of reframing how we view the food system as a food security ecosystem so we can really start to draw out, highlight our highest priority vulnerabilities and work back from there. But another key point to make is that in a world where we might not have the same level of access to Northern Hemisphere trade and markets to what we've traditionally enjoyed, and when you talk about supply chain resilience, my belief is that you inevitably run into the need to shorten your supply chains. Elizabeth Jackson from Curtin University gave me a really funny meme to use, but that's really true, is a nonna in her backyard growing lettuces from the 40s and said, Nonna was resilient because she knew her supply chains were short and she knew how to do stuff. She knew how to do stuff. And I think that's really salient for us as a nation stuck down here at the bottom of the world that's inherently reliant on that connectedness where we started. If we're going to shorten supply chains, we can't onshore everything. We cannot be self-sufficient. But I think we can be much more focused on a concept of regional self-reliance to make sure that we maintain a safe and secure Indo-Pacific, and I think food can be used as a primary part of that. So when we elevate that conversation, I think everything can fall back into it in terms of orders of priority.
Throughout this conference, we have heard and spoken quite a bit about this concept of protectionism and how that may not be the best approach for Australia, if not impossible. When we look to other parts of our neighbourhood and closely abroad, there is this sense of regionalism, and we're seeing that with China, Japan, India making trade deals and partnerships that are not global, they're not protectionist, but they're regional. Is there anything you could add to that, DJ, in terms of one of the election priorities for the NFF talks about securing these global markets? And I guess just to flow on from some of the things that Andrew said, how do you do that? What is your ask to the government?
Well, that's one of the great things of working in this sector. It's not just one minister, one department. It is multifaceted to achieve an outcome. And I totally agree with Andrew, which makes the panel a bit boring, I guess. But aid is super important if we want stability. And how we do that, and the more strategic nature that we've seen other nations do that in our own backyard, is something that we need to be alert to. And once again, for trade to be successful, we've got to get either the benefit or either physically or geopolitically. And when we've got concerns around instability, we have to look after our own patch. And we're quite supportive of government's initiative to put more investment into Southeast Asia. We also understand the economic drivers for that, but even just the regionality of supply chains and the opportunities that that presents is something that we are not underscoring. We believe that is front and centre, especially in the protein discussion. And this is the other part. You've got to remember, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the 1% of the world. We live a very good high standard of living. People aspire to be us. They aspire to wear our clothes, eat our diets, live in our buildings. So they look to how can they get what we have. And that's a great thing. We should be proud that we've come that far. But also acknowledge that we also have a lot of influence in how that can be achieved. And if we do this in the right way, that there should be stable growth in our area so that they can meet those aspirations. But trade, aid, and building stronger partnerships de-escalates a lot of the tensions locally. But once again, it is amazing how we can have such a focus on one tweet that changes our lens overnight.
It's almost like you knew the question that was coming, because I'm going to flip that sentiment and turn the card over and talk about the responsibility of our food production and food system to the world. There's a question that's come from the floor saying, how can we link future nutrition, reduction in obesity and diabetes, new dietary standards with climate and nature resilient land and sea use? There's a lot in this, but I will summarise it in, it's basically a story of two tales. We've got high standards and access to food in Australia, but also a responsibility to feed the rest of the world and supply this nutrition, protein, and I'm keen to hear just on the back of your points about the importance of aid, but also just the expectations of some of these markets that we export into and the role that Australian produce is playing in not just feeding their population, but avoiding malnutrition.
I think that might be an answer question for you, Andrew. No, there's a lot in that. So I always like talking analogies, and my sister's going to hate me for dobbing her in. But whenever we have a meal at her place, she lives in the city in Melbourne and does pretty well. They usually put the food scraps in the bin, and it drives me wild. Absolutely drives me wild, especially protein. It just drives me wild because there are so many people, and food waste is a huge issue for us as a nation as well, let alone when we talk obesity and diet. Food waste is real, and more we can prevent that, and that starts with us and our choices and how much our portion sizing is, and then what we can do with our excess. But to adequately understand food, we're having a different conversation. When we're talking about sustainability or even carbon units now being talked about in nutrition sense, it warps reality in my eyes when you've got some real fundamentals that aren't being addressed around who cooks a meal from scratch nowadays. We're so reliant on barcodes to feed us. We don't eat as much raw, unprocessed food as we used to. Now that's a function of time. We're very time poor in that sense.
And yet a lot of the markets that we export into to provide the food and nutrition, they don't have the luxury of all of that. They don't get to waste their food. They don't get to have pre-made ready meals to pull out of the fridge, or the energy that would even keep the fridge on to store that food. I'm very conscious of the time. We've got 2 minutes. So
my point would be understand the market and deliver what they need so that they can handle the goods that they require.
Great point to end on there. Thanks, DJ. I've got so many questions that I could continue to roll through here that are very reflective of all of the points and the themes that you're making. So perhaps we can continue the conversation over afternoon tea while everybody is networking. To the delegates that have joined us online, certainly have not forgotten you and would love you to keep sending in those questions and continuing that conversation online, because that's just another marketplace for ideas and thought, and this conference is centred on that. But really to sum up the things that we've spoken about here today, and I thank you all for entertaining us in our mission to create a new way of thinking with some of this stuff, because I guess you summed it up. This is a new way of thinking, Andrew. We do not yet have the policy, the frameworks, or the regulation in place for looking at agriculture and food systems, food production as a national security issue. I would like to end it there and see you all after afternoon tea.